What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 42nd edition of Tequila Tuesday, or Scotty's Little Sales Club, brought to you and powered by Sendoso, Scotty's Little Sales Club's official sending partner and platform. Excited to have this conversation. I didn't tell any of you this, but tonight's guest and honoree is Matt Stuart. And Matt Stuart was actually my boss and the co-CEO and co-founder of Main Street Hub, and the reason that I moved from San Francisco to Austin. Matt also sort of relocated from San Francisco to Austin. That's not the purpose of this conversation though, but it's just a little fun side note, anecdote, whatever you want to call it. Matt's a two-time founder. He's building I'll let him explain what he's building, but it's a very powerful platform and specifically focused on a segment of the market that's near and dear to my heart, and maybe doesn't get as much love in TLC as it deserves. He can talk a little bit about the founder journey. He's also going to talk a little bit about the intersection of RevOps and performance, as well as the need for CRM enablement, kind of innovation and disruption a little bit. So, Matt, welcome to Tequila Tuesday, man.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Good to see y'all. And please, Scott will take your lead here, but interject with questions, comments, whatever. Would love to make this as interactive as possible, so you don't have to sit here and listen to me talk. But yeah, I'll dive in right away with the founding story of Main Street Hub, which was very much a sales story, and very much thanks to Scott. So we started Main Street Hub. My co-founder and I started Main Street Hub in 2010, and it was a pivot from a prior business that he and I did together when we were introduced by mutual friends in graduate school. And the friends heard us talking about similar things, about starting a company that made a big social impact, but also was for profit, and therefore we thought a very long-term sustainable business model. And that original company was born out of my co-founder's girlfriend at the time, now wife, who almost got ripped off by a car dealership when she was getting her Honda Civic repaired in the Bay Area in California. And my co-founder had started on a journey to help insert transparency into the auto repair world and help consumers find a good auto mechanic. And we were introduced in that period of time, and we made a bunch of classic entrepreneurial mistakes as we embarked on that journey. We were building based on our own assumptions of what we thought our customers needed, as opposed to listening to our customers to build a variety of mistakes that I'm happy to go into if that's helpful. But long story short, after about a year of building a product and about $100,000 spent in developing a product that our customers at the time, this pilot program of 30 auto repair shops around the Bay Area in California, that our customers effectively didn't really want, we pivoted to what became Main Street Hub. But one of the lessons learned in that period of time that may be interesting, just as we think about design thinking applied to either starting a company or scaling a sales process or anything, was we could have skipped a year and $100,000 by just taking our assumptions and a hypothesis, putting it on a piece of paper with a pencil, and putting that in front of our potential customers and saying, long story short, would you use this? And use a pencil like you'd use a computer mouse, and would you use the software like this? Literally, we would have found out in like a day that they wouldn't have, for a variety of reasons, and saved a bunch of time and money. And I think the same design thinking can be applied to sales processes as well, where you build, measure, iterate, and go through that build, measure, learn loop as fast as possible. And as we talk about scaling Main Street Hub, and currently relates to what I'm working on now, that design thinking applied to scaling sales and scaling sales processes, sales labs, et cetera, is front and center in the lessons learned and the success we saw on sales side of Main Street Hub. But anyway, we pivoted to Main Street Hub when we started listening to what our customers wanted, which is basically, hey, this product that you built, which was effectively pricing information and qualitative reviews, think like Kelley Blue Book and Yelp to help consumers find an auto repair shop. They said, hey, I don't need that, but can you help me respond to this review I got on Yelp? Or can you make me a Facebook page? Long story short. And we had this pilot program of 30 customers And when we finally started listening to them and said, okay, if we built you a Facebook page and managed the Facebook page for you, would you pay us $100 a month, which is pretty arbitrary, just sort of guess on pricing. And the first 7 of those 30 we talked to signed up on the spot. I remember the second one pulled out $87 from his pocket and said, I have $87 in cash. Will you take that instead of $100 of a check or a credit card? And we said, absolutely. But that was an important moment because we got a really strong signal of demand from our customers that, you know, that we were building something that they wanted to buy. And again, first 7 literally signed up, you know, on the spot. And so I basically split up, me and my co-founder basically split up the functions in the company around that period of time. I was basically doing all the sales, and he was basically doing account management and product as we were starting to build and manage Facebook pages for small businesses. We hadn't figured out the technology yet, let alone how to scale the technology. We just knew there was a need for that product with the market, and we started building. And so I did sales door to door and then cold calling for 6 months. And that was one of the most impactful career experiences I've ever had. I learned a ton about myself, certainly informed everything I'm working on since. And it was a really valuable lesson learned. So, you know, whether I'm working with sales leaders or talking to other founders, I think this applies to sales processes as well, and sales leaders and sales processes, but the founders being able to sell the product initially, and the first step of figuring out a scalable sales process in a startup is selling the product yourself, so you understand the value proposition, the pain points, et cetera, was extremely helpful and important, and highly recommend that approach. Again, whether it's a sales leader testing a new sales process or a founder starting a company. Shortly thereafter, we hired a couple of sales reps and then met Scott Leese, which I'll get into in a second, but let me pause there. Scott and folks, is this the direction that is helpful for the group? And is this the type of founding story you were hoping to hear about?
Yeah, for me it is. It's good backdrop, and keep going.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, great. So did about 6 months of sales, you know, on my own, door to door first, and then on the phone. And me and my co-founder's doing a little bit of sales. We got a little bit competitive about it, both on the sales side, but also we had this chess clock in a library room at school where we were sort of working out of. And the way our product worked is we would sell a customer and then we would onboard them and start their content on social media. And I was doing the sales and he was doing the content. So we were sort of racing to see whether, you know, I could bring on a new customer faster than he could onboard and start implementing the content, which was a blast. So that sort of that fun competitive spirit was embedded in the company early, and especially on the sales side. And once we started getting what we felt like was replicable results from the founder selling it, that's when we wanted to make sure that the sales results we were seeing were scalable and replicable beyond the founder. So we hired 2 sales reps in that period of time. This is still 2010. And one of those sales reps is actually J.M. Wilkie, who's now working with Scott, and moved to Austin at the same time as Scott and myself and a couple other team members. So it's awesome to see her still in Austin and still in the mix, but she did a phenomenal job. And we wrote down, JM and I and another sales rep named Anthony wrote down the sales process in the form of a sales script to make sure that what we were saying we could sort of repeat and make it replicable. And there's a couple, I think, key things in that moment that are valuable lessons learned, and I would do again for sure. One is first, founder selling it or a sales leader selling it themselves. Second, hiring 2 salespeople in this moment as opposed to 1, because if we had an outlier, if one of those 2 reps was an outlier and was, you know, extremely great at sales or wasn't getting results, we didn't want to be overly persuaded. So 2 data points is infinitely better than 1. And then using a script to make sure we were sticking to a replicable process, so that as we had a baseline of results, we could make sure that baseline was tied to a process. And if we iterated on the process, we compare the results of the new process to the results on the baseline. So again, design thinking really applied to the sales process for us, and that we were applying the same design thinking to building our product and elsewhere in the business, but this was design thinking being applied to the sales process as well. So in this moment when we had, 2 sales reps and myself, actually it was mainly at this point now 2 sales reps selling and me helping them sell, and we started to see what we thought was replicable, scalable results. That's when we made the decision to hire a VP of sales, who was Scott Leese, who JM introduced us to through her network in San Francisco. And from there, Scott really helped us build out the rest of the sales team. And there's a couple things to double click on there. I think one, we hired a VP of sales relatively early, which I get asked a decent amount when to hire the first VP of sales. And I think it depends on a few things, but I think it's basically when you feel like you have a replicable sales process and can start hitting the gas on sales.
Can I ask you a question about that real quick, Matt?
Absolutely.
Was that like a particular number of deals? Was it a particular revenue amount? Was it a particular number of reps? Those 3 things people ask me about all the time, like when they're trying to figure out when is the right time.
Yeah, so I think founders selling it themselves to 2 reps is for sure the right approach. And founders selling it themselves, like when you're starting to crank out sales, you kind of know when you want to see if someone else if that's scalable and replicable. So that's more of a feeling thing. Once you have 2 reps, there is a phenomenal article that I'm happy to share with the group called The Sales Learning Curve that describes this really well, better than I will. But basically, if I remember correctly, it basically says when your sales reps are producing about 2 times your cost, their cost, predictably, that's when it's time to scale beyond that. And I think that's a really good heuristic. I think it doesn't matter the velocity of the sales in that moment or the MRR or whatever. I think it's a matter of return on cost, which also will be a proxy for whether you have a scalable process for your sales cycle, enterprise, mid-market, transactional, et cetera.
Okay, great.
So we hired Scott in this moment. We felt like we had a replicable process. Those 2 reps were producing more than 2 times their cost in recurring revenue. And this is where I'm just super grateful for Scott, frankly, and getting this hire right in this moment in time was a game changer for Main Street Hub. But we had no idea what we were doing on sales. Like I had no sales experience before this. I worked in finance. This sort of putting a script down and hiring 2 reps was a little bit more kind of intuitive and just applying design thinking, not knowing anything about sales. And so, when we hired Scott and he brought in almost immediately this team of 12 reps, he just taught us everything. He's like, all right, the right ratio is 12 to 1 roughly, 10 to 15 to 1, and we want this type of manager and this type of rep profile, and their comp is going to look like this, and I mean, that accelerated our learning curve significantly, and it would have taken forever to get to those learnings. And so I think the point there is, once you know that you have a scalable process on a good business model, that's when I would hire not the manager, but a more senior sales leader to start scaling in that moment quickly. And the trade-off, we talked about the trade-off between manager and sales director and VP of sales in that moment. But I think go big there. And then similarly, as a sales leader, evaluating what company to get, to join and at what stage, I think understanding the scalability and the replicability of those early results, if it's an early stage company, is key. So that's like sort of looking at it through both lenses. So right around this time, we decided to move to Austin as we were starting to scale the company. But again, let me pause there, Scott, and see if you want to direct me. You clearly know the story at this point, if you want to direct me in one way or another here.
Yeah, I think the next part that would be interesting is we were sort of building a distributed culture in 2011, way before, it was the only way to do it or the hip kind of thing. Maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about how, as a founder and sales leader, like you started to think about that and shape that, because that's super applicable today for everybody who's, either selling remote or leading remote and that type of stuff.
Yeah, so we had this hypothesis Well, first I should say we moved from San Francisco to Austin as we started to scale the people count of the company. So we had 11 people in San Francisco. This is now mid 2011, and we needed more office space. And we were realizing as the business model of Main Street Hub was starting to emerge, we were very early startup at this point, that we were going to be a larger company in terms of size of people. And so we started thinking about where our office space would be. And we were in Soma in San Francisco. And so we thought, well, we probably don't belong in downtown San Francisco. Maybe we should go to like Oakland in the East Bay or down to, Palo Alto or something. But all of our team was in San Francisco. So we thought, hey, we might lose the team even if we move to just places that are like 30, 45 minutes, an hour away. And so we should really put every city in the country up for discussion about where we move. And long story short, after evaluating all the cities, we landed in Austin, which was primarily a talent decision. Some people say, oh, you picked Austin because it was cheaper to operate in Austin, right? No, actually, although it was 30% cheaper to operate than downtown San Francisco, the reason was access to great talent, including great sales talent. And so our original hypothesis was to pick up and move the entire company from San Francisco to Austin. But when we moved to Austin, at the very beginning, our sales results were lower than they had been in San Francisco, with nothing changing other than we had, moved offices. By the way, 8 of the 11 people moved with us from San Francisco to Austin. I think the majority of those people, myself, Scott, my co-founder, et cetera, included, are still here, JM, which is great. So we were really proud of that moment, but nothing had really changed other than changing location. So one of our hypotheses was that it was more helpful to be closer to our customers that we were calling into. And we were calling a lot in Northern California at the time. And so we immediately turned around and reopened an office in San Francisco, and that office started outperforming Austin. Also, Scott had a network in San Francisco, easier to recruit there a little bit. But we rolled with this hypothesis of, if we're closer to the markets we're calling into, our set rate on demos and our close rate on demos will be higher.
I just put in the chat, Matt, the phrase that we came up with, which is like local buys from local.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, fast forward to the end, we ended up we opened offices in San Francisco, then New York and LA. Fast forward to the end, we actually changed our view of that hypothesis and centralized everyone in Austin, where we had at the end 350 sellers plus 25 managers plus infrastructure around them. But in the beginning, we thought smaller offices that were localized was the right answer. There are a few lessons on that. One is, it was really challenging to operate those different offices. I mean, Scott and I were sort of flying around the country to these different offices, and I think that was, we weren't really thinking about it as remote. I think now people think about that a little bit differently, and I would have thought about it. I would have operated differently with the lessons learned from COVID for sure. But it was certainly challenging to manage all these different offices. And one of the things that I remember that was challenging for Scott and I and the sales leaders on the team were just these different cultures that kind of emerge. Well, culture is the wrong word. I define culture as sort of, are we living our values? But these different kind of like operating rhythms, sort of environments in the office that emerged. And one of the really tactical things that was challenging in that period of time was this perception that like headquarters was different and getting better things, getting different things. In reality, frankly, Scott and I were in other offices probably more than headquarters. But everyone else had this perception that like headquarters was getting more access to leadership and more this and more that. And so this sort of like perception versus reality, I remember just being a consistent problem in that period of time. And frankly, it was a massive distraction, for lack of a better word, to be traveling to all these offices constantly, which is something we underestimated. We saw massive gains when we centralized things at the end of the Main Street Hub journey back to Austin. But I don't know, Scott, anything you would add there in terms of those days when we had the 4 offices and we were going all over the place?
I'm having PTSD from taking 6 a.m. flights to New York and taking a cab and all this stuff, and then flying home 3 days later and then going to LA on Monday. Yeah. Glad I don't have to do that world anymore. Let me pause you here, Matt, because we have a number of questions already. Yep. Sanjay, I don't see you, but you typed your question in. Are you here, Sanjay?
Hey Scott, I am here. Sorry, I was just driving.
No worries, man.
Can I ask my question?
Yes, sir.
I'm good, Scott. Thanks. So yeah, the question that I had when you mentioned the script and you did it kind of just on the fly, but maybe you can talk about kind of how you did it and also what worked in terms of building the script.
Yeah, for sure. And before I forget to mention it on the last point, what I think we got wrong in the hypothesis, but is ultimately just an unambiguously good thing, was it was all about sales talent. Like when San Francisco was performing better, it was because the talent was better. When New York was performing better, New York was our top performing office, it was when the talent was better there. We had similar processes. It was a matter of talent and then being consistent on the processes and all the normal things that we all know as sales leaders. But I mean, like at the end of the day, it was just about, in those early days, it was just about the talent. But anyway, so yeah, on the script, I mean, in that to answer your question directly, in that very first turn of the script, it was just, what was I saying as a founder? And keep in mind, I had no idea what I was sort of talking about or had no sales experience. What was I saying? How can I write that down in a way that someone else can kind of follow a process? It was as simple as that. It wasn't optimizing for anything. It was just, what am I saying that anecdotally seems to be resonating? I'm going to put those words on a page and see if that scales with other people saying similar things. But that moment of writing that down and then having two sales reps, JM and Anthony, sell those words, like sell on the same process on that script, was the beginning of what we called later in the Main Street Hub journey a sales lab, where we basically have one hypothesis, which was my hypothesis at that period of time. And we have everyone follow that same process. So they can't really deviate from the process. They kind of have to follow that process. And then we measure the results of that process and we iterate accordingly. And if we see a 20% plus improvement on our sales process as a result of that iteration of the script, which would be our hypothesis in this sort of like sales lab test, we'd scale that to the floor. And so when we had 350 sellers at Main Street Hub, we would have one team, which was a sales lab team, that we would constantly, actually not constantly, once a quarter, we found was the right cadence to do this, be testing a new hypothesis for something. And that hypothesis was often a script, to your question, but it could be a new product rollout, it could be a new process, it could be a new sales tool, it could be a variety of things. But we'd be using what we call the sales lab to be applying this design thinking that was embedded in our culture from day one to test new iterations of sales processes, including scripting. And we could talk for an hour about just the lessons learned in the sales lab. We had specific compensation for it. We found that once quarterly was the right cadence to do it. We found that 20%, we had to see a 20% lift because we got better results in the sales lab than we did when we rolled it to the floor, et cetera. Lots of some unintuitive lessons from the sales lab stuff, and happy to talk more about that. But I think the point is, one person won't know the right way to organize the English language to put on a piece of paper in a script for a product until you test it. And so it's have a hypothesis, test it, measure it, and once you see actual results, then scale it.
And can I take one crack at giving a little bit of an answer here?
Yeah.
Sanjay, one thing that I would tell you to do is write out like a guide at first. Don't think about writing out like the whole conversation at first. Write out like, here's the flow of the perfect sales call. They say hello, there's a little bit of an intro. I ask them a couple questions. I figure out what their pain is, and all the way through to like closing a deal, like a perfect kind of situation. So now you have like the skeleton of it, and then you just add dialogue from each piece, from one part to the next, and just kind of write it out like a movie script. Exactly the words that you would use. You hear yourself having a conversation in your head, and you just write that down. It will always come out much, much longer initially, and over time you find ways to chop it down and say the exact same thing with less words, and so it shrinks over time. That's like a super practical way to get started writing a script. So thanks, Sanjay, for your question. Yeah, Zach Hynek.
I had a follow-up question from actually Scott and Amy did a kind of like mock VP interview in one of their sessions. And one thing that really stuck with me was one, just how captivating Scott was in his whole pitch and building his team and what's most important to him, and how he really avoided the KPI and the actual metrics of the conversation and being held to actual real tangible firm numbers. So I'd be curious if that was similar, Matt, in your interview when you were going through the process, and how much of that was you really just liking and appreciating Scott as a person and the team he was trying to build, and really the momentum you thought he would bring to the team, versus he was really laying out a specific plan that you saw the numbers and you were like, I like these numbers.
So this is when I was interviewing Scott before he was hired.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Scott can probably remember this. Very focused. I maybe to a fault. Very focused on process and planning. So definitely was. I mean, I certainly enjoyed Scott and really liked Scott, and all of we had rapport and all of those things. But I was super focused on like, what is the very specific process that you're going to follow here, and what results should we expect from that? And I remember really grilling Scott on that, and my co-founder Andrew too. And I mean, Scott completely nailed it and really laid out like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. But it was all born from his prior experience too. He had worked in an environment that a sales process, selling some, similar advertising, basically. I mean, Main Street Hub was an advertising, but selling marketing stuff, customer acquisition tools to a broadly similar SMB customer base as us. And he had just not only seen that movie before, but directed that movie. And I think that was really important. And that, I mean, that's one of the more important things when I'm looking to hire a sales leader, and happy to talk about other things I look for. But one is a fit with the sales process. A 20-year career enterprise sales leader, it's going to be hard to have that person sell in a transactional sales environment. And, the sales cycle that Scott had come up through, first as a cold calling sales rep, top performing, then manager, et cetera, was very similar to the sales process we wanted to drive at Main Street Hub. And so he knew exactly to a T what he wanted to do. And we knew nothing. And it was like, we want that. But it was very specific.
So how do I phrase this? Goes to show, if you go back on the interview from last week, Zach, like, you could lead with all of that stuff, right? But what I said last week that Amy kind of didn't like and said it was me playing games, which is fine. But what I said was, if I talk about the things that I want to talk about the most, and then wait for them, meaning the founder, to ask me questions about tactics or process or numbers or KPIs, I feel like, okay, I got the answer right here. Like, I can do it. That's not my biggest passion. So I don't want to talk about that. So I'd be memorable at these other things. And then I have good, solid, sound, logical answers for more tactical and data kind of stuff. Right. So there you go. Good question. Good follow-up from last week. Eric Steves, you're next. I see you. Can you get yourself off mute?
Thought you guys had me muted. Thanks.
That's Thursdays. Here,
Gotcha.
You take yourself off.
It's anarchy. So trying to be as direct as possible. We founded a tiny agency, and I had all these lofty ideas about ICP and felt so smart writing it all down. And then our network got involved, and who we wound up doing business with was totally different. And I've heard some founders describe having that experience too when they're selling their product first. But I guess what I would wonder is, what do founders really do better than agency founders? Like, if they're going to go to the product level and they're going to go to scale, like from the beginning, what are they doing better, the ones that succeed, than someone who's just going to have an agency where they make like a couple $100,000 a year?
It's a good question. Let me know if this answers your question. And first, I would highly recommend the book on this topic, Lean Startup by Eric Ries. I think all roads point back to the following. First, pick sort of an idea that checks some fundamental boxes, like, I actually, to reference another book, I'd actually start with the hedgehog concept from Good to Great, which is, what drives your economic engine? What am I passionate about? And importantly, I think people forget, what am I, quote, best in the world at, or what am I uniquely positioned to do? And good to great, that's applied to what made companies great versus just good. I think that can be applied to people also. But that is like, that's one template, but starting with an idea that can create a good business model in a big market. Then from there, the ability to pivot into product market fit, which the lean startup is an excellent source of description for. If you have product market fit with a good business model in a big market, it's basically game over. And so that's it. I mean, it's very hard to do all those things, but you know, first idea, and then the ability to pivot into product market fit or navigate into product market fit. And so whether you do that as an agency or you do that as a founder, that's what it's all about, in my opinion.
Nailed it for me. Thanks.
Right on. Tanner, you're up next.
All right. Something that I've caught on as you've been talking through is, right, as you were scaling your team and scaling your company, so you changed your strategy a few times. And as we've been doing that here at Spiff, we've had the same thing, and we have a really hard time changing or adjusting our strategy without causing like mass hysteria on the sales team, with everyone thinking that everything's dying and that the company's failing, when in fact it's the opposite. We're learning something, we're growing. Curious like how you manage that, and how you guys set your team up to understand like we're changing things, but it's okay. Like it's actually a good thing.
Yeah, that is something that I have certainly, my co-founder too, we got better at over the course of our journey. And you know, we grew from, in Main Street Hub, we grew from, you know, 10 people right around the time we hired Scott to 25 people a couple months later to 100 people just a few months later. And in that period of time, that's just from a kind of people perspective, there's a lot of change happening. And I remember, for example, and let me know if this is not the direction you're meaning for this question, but like, I remember, for example, the first time we sort of had a wave of kind of like turnover on the team. And, you know, we were scaling really quickly, and some people just a few months ago, the job was a perfect fit for them. And now maybe the job scaled, you know, quickly beyond their current capacity. And, you know, maybe they decided to leave the company, or they changed roles, or there's just turnover happening, kind of churn happening in the middle of all of this scaling. There were many times where people on the team were sort of freaked out, wondering if something was going wrong, et cetera. And this is going to sound overly simplistic maybe, but so let me know if this is directly answering your question. Just tell me if not. You know, just confidence and transparency. Like if things are going well, just being totally transparent about that and confident with it and explaining it. By the way, if things aren't, still confidence and transparency, but just like consistently explaining what's going on, building trust with people, and saying that it's okay. And I think, you know, people relatively quickly, built trust in us, or we built trust in them by taking that approach. And Scott, I'd be curious for your perspective in some of those early periods of time. Remember conversations we were having in San Francisco and those sorts of things. But I mean, truly just, you know, here's where we are, here's what's going on, here's where we're going, here's what it's going to look like when we get there. You know, all the people might not look the same, and that's okay. Just those kind of direct conversations with transparency. I don't know that there's another way to do it other than building trust and being honest and being transparent.
As you were talking about people like leaving in the first wave and all that kind of things, one of the things that happened, Tanner, was we kind of showed up out of nowhere and quickly got on the map in Austin as like, holy cow, who are all these Main Street Hub salespeople? And they're growing super fast, and like these kids must be good. And everybody came after us trying to poach. And one of the people who came after us trying to poach was Google, because Google around this time was launching their Groupon and Living Social competitor, Google Offers. So all of a sudden, like we were growing and doing really well, and Google showed up and offered people like a 2 to 3x base salary than what we were offering. And it's like, oh, you know, and then some people will be panicking and be like, we're never going to be able to grow. We're never going to be able to hire again. You know, this kind of stuff. So anyway.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do 2 more questions, and I'm gonna let Matt kind of get back on track, and then we'll go back to Matt's kind of story, and he'll pivot a little bit towards like this need in the market that he sees and this problem with kind of tooling and CRM and all this kind of stuff. So I got Nikki and then Anthony.
Hey, Matt. Hey, Scott. Hey, everyone. It's a little bit further back when you were talking about scripts and what it takes to build them. Thank you for that insight. When you're testing those, is there, a number of calls that, constitute a good enough sample size? First part of the question. Second part is, are you testing the script as a whole? Or is this more testing openers, a value prop question in particular? How does that work?
Yeah, great question. It could be any of the above, and it depends on what you're testing. So if you're testing, at Main Street Hub, for example, we had a cold call script. We had a demo guide that we showed with slides. We had a bunch of rebuttals. We had a bunch of sort of ancillary documents, many, many pages of scripting. The demo guide itself was like 17 pages. We had a lot of scripting. And so, we did a lot of iterating and testing just on the cold call. And one of the things we tested was what we call the 60-second pitch, which is the beginning of a cold call, basically like pitching the gatekeeper to just build enough value to go through the next steps in the sales cycle. In that, I don't have hey, you need X number of dials, but you need way more dials to understand whether you're getting good results on sort of the front end of the pitch. If you're testing, say, new pricing, you're effectively testing, close rate and average MRR sold. The dials matter less in that moment. It just matters how many demos you're getting into, and in our sales process, how many demos you're getting into, and what the close rate is, and how that close rate and MRR, or how the close rate and the average sales price compare to the baseline. And so my point is, I don't have a magic number for you, but be really crisp about what you're testing. We had this template that we used called a test plan that was basically like, here's our hypothesis. Here's the metric we want to affect. In order to affect that metric, we're going to do these activities, and we're going to scale it to the floor only if we do this. And that last point is really important. What success looks like in the test, because that's before you start the test, it's an objective. Here's what success looks like, and here's what failure looks like. And if we're successful, we're going to roll it to the floor. And if we're not successful, we're going to decide whether to scrap the test altogether and forget the hypothesis, or pivot because maybe we just missed, maybe we learned something and we want to tweak one thing that we're testing and start the process over again.
Thank you. Super helpful.
Right on. Okay, Anthony.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Matt. My question is, what are the challenges you had to face to help you define the sales process with Scott and JM Wilkins? As well, how did you teach that to onboard new talents?
I think it comes down to being really focused and disciplined on a process. I mean, to be fair and directly answer your question, it was, hey, Scott, like, what should we do here in this moment in time? And he wrote a pitch, sold it himself, I believe, then trained the reps that he hired directly, and we were off to the races. But in general, I think breaking that down, it was, again, sales leader selling on a process, making sure that process is replicable, following the process, making sure other people are following it via training, and then just consistently applying the process. One of the biggest challenges that I had as a, CEO of Main Street Hub, overseeing sort of like working with the sales team, was making sure people are consistently applying the process. This even ties back to the challenges we had with having 4 sales offices instead of 1. If we saw a spike or a decrease in performance in one of our sales offices, so many times it had to do with just a deviation from the sales process, which is super frustrating. And by the way, we're building a solution for that in the new software we're building, which is one of the reasons I'm passionate about building the software we're building. But like consistently applying the process is key. And I mean, it just, you can probably all relate to this, but one of the things that drives me crazy, but I get it. I've cold called and I for a consistent period of time, and I get it. But like, if this first sentence in the script works, I don't understand why you use a different sentence. But I mean, I understand it and I've done it, but like, that's the first sentence. You're not, handling an objection, and just like getting people to just consistently follow that process, as we all know, is a whole thing. And so the consistently following the process, it just cannot be overstated.
Every single founder, sales leader, and parent knows exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Oh, it's torture.
And,
Thanks,
one thing that's interesting on that, and this is something we all know as well. If you onboard a new training class and they just came out of training, they sell like pretty darn well, and they get into a lot of demo, like the front end of the process works really well. Why? Because they're just freaking reading this thing. Over time, you see that the performance, especially on the front end, often dip, and you have to retrain. Why? Because they are adjusting that to that process. So the consistency in applying the process cannot be overstated.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the insight. I had no idea. I'm not a founder or a parent.
Thanks, Anthony. All right, Matt. So we talked a lot about the Main Street Hub journey and everything. Let's pivot a little bit to like the problem now that you've seen and identified and are working on solving. Like, we had a huge sales organization in Main Street Hub, hundreds of people, multiple layers all over the place. Talk a little bit about like why this CRM is kind of stuck and hasn't evolved, why some of these other tools are maybe built specifically for a particular end of the market and not for another end. Let's get into that stuff a little bit.
Yeah, sounds good. So, in this period of time in San Francisco, I remember just, we were deciding what sales tool to use to have our, basically what CRM to pick to have our data housed as we started the cold call. And, I remember that my co-founder and I looked at each other and we were like, Salesforce is best in class. Let's buy Salesforce and scale on Salesforce. And this is before Outreach, Gong, Chorus, a bunch of more, recent sales tools existed. And we just started building on Salesforce and never stopped building on Salesforce. So we built this relatively sophisticated sales stack on Salesforce. And, we just kept building and cobbling it together. Over time, and we sort of started when we didn't know what we were doing in sales, and sort of fast forward to the end, we were frustrated with the shortcomings of our sales stack. And that's not sort of blaming Salesforce, just the shortcomings of our sales stack. One of the key reasons for that is that Salesforce, and frankly, all of these other sales tools, are built for enterprise sales processes first and not transactional sales processes. And, transactional sales is just so often an afterthought for all of these companies. And it's sad, frankly. And all these tools are built first for enterprise. And so there are so many differences in a sales process from transactional sales versus enterprise, and, cobbling together an enterprise, a transactional, which we were at Main Street Hub, sales process on an enterprise sales stack is really hard. And a couple of things on that. First of all, like if you read all the press releases from all these sales tools, they're all highlighting like the enterprise sales processes that they have, and like no one is talking about transactional sales processes. And so one of the things that we wanted to build was, first and foremost, a sales software that's primarily focused on transactional sales processes. I define transactional sales processes, by the way, as two things. One is a sales cycle from 1 day to 90 days. And so some people consider part of that mid-market, but 1 day to 90 days, or a description of transactional sales that I like and got from my friend who's the founder of Chorus, another sales software tool that is focused on enterprise, is if your sales leaders in an organization are having conversations with sellers and it's about activities in a funnel, so dials, set demos, held demos, close rate, that's transactional. If your sales leaders are having conversations with sellers in an organization about logos and mapping stakeholders in an organization, and how did Susan's internal meeting go with John and those sorts of things, that's a more enterprise sales process. And those are just two different everythings. Different sales leaders, like we talked about before, different sales people, different sales processes, and certainly different sales software. So the first thing is, we wanted to build a tool to solve some of the pain points we felt at Main Street Hub that was focused almost exclusively on transactional sales process. Like every feature we build is for transactional sales. And so basically what we've done is build it's called OpsIQ, and it's an operating system for a transactional sales process. So operating system meaning all-in-one dialer, CRM, revenue intelligence tool, sales enablement tool, all the buzzwords all in one, so that your sales team could just sit in one sales software. And that was one of the other pain points we wanted to solve was, as you cobble together these systems, you have your sales reps and your sales managers and your sales team switching to all these different systems, which is not an enjoyable experience. It's painful to scale. You don't get as good results, and the data is really hard. So, the all-in-one is a pain point we wanted to solve. But there's so many, like the reason I'm passionate about building what we're building right now, in addition to those 2 points, is so many of the lessons learned and pain points across like all of building Main Street Hub in all departments, not just sales, were, almost all roads point back to some of these problems, and then pain points within our software that we just said so many times. And I remember conversations with Scott, like the software should just do this for us. So for example, we're talking about staying on the script consistently. It would be great to have software that basically tells you whether your sales reps are following the pitch. This is something that we talked about in 2010, 11, 12, et cetera. Now, since then, Gong and Chorus have done some revenue intelligence stuff that helps you get there. But by the way, those things are focused on enterprise sales processes. What I want to build in OpsIQ, just as an example, is load our 17-page demo guide at Main Street Hub into OpsIQ and give a percentage score about how on pitch our sales reps are. That would have saved me a lot of flights to New York to figure out why people aren't following the script and who's following the script and what sales leaders are telling, yada, yada, yada.
Saves a sales leader a lot of time too, from going back and forth with the rep, and the rep says, I'm on script, Scott. What are you talking about? I'm on script. Oh,
exactly.
Your adherence score is 62%.
Exactly.
Right, Cynthia? That would never be you though, Cynthia. No, you would, yeah.
And, another example of a pain point that was really, painful for us at Main Street Hub that we're setting up to solve is creating a tool that's really helpful and easy for sales managers and sales leaders to provide coaching and development to sales reps. I'm a believer that the biggest needle mover in a sales organization, besides raw sales talent, is coaching and development. And we want to create a tool that enables and facilitates sales leaders to coach and develop reps in as close to real time as possible. So for example, learned this from Scott. We did call breakdowns at Main Street Hub, right? Like not a super novel concept, but we get sales reps in a room or one-on-one manager to sales rep and break down their calls. Now, we over time, we got smarter and smarter at that. And what we wanted to say is, hey, like if Scott's my manager and I'm a rep, and maybe Scott has identified through my KPIs and metrics that I'm good at getting decision makers on the phone, but I'm struggling with setting demos with decision makers. Well, if we believe that a way that Scott can improve my performance is to break down my calls with me or have me listen to those calls where I'm struggling or where I'm succeeding, pulling those calls out of a system out of a sales software to surface that conversation between me and Scott was extremely painful in our Salesforce driven sales stack. So for example, in OpsIQ, you can pull call results by sales rep, by call kind of disposition, like call recordings by sales rep, by call disposition, real time, and pull up those calls. And so it's what can the software do to facilitate a transactional sales process? Because that is much more meaningful in a transactional sales process than an enterprise sales process. Not that the coaching isn't as important, not that breaking down calls isn't important, but in an enterprise sales process, the meeting looks way different than the front end of a cold call in a transactional sales process. And so you want a tool that enables the manager to break down, for example, the front end of a cold call with a sales rep, which is totally different in an enterprise sales cycle. And so we had all these conversations about how can the software should be able to do this stuff. Why doesn't it? And the answer is, well, the tools that exist are built for enterprise sales processes first. And so we're super, super excited about it. And I mean, specifically, a lot of these things were things that Scott and I talked about, like literally back in 2012. There's one conversation I remember. We were sitting in our office in LA. Scott and I were with my co-founder, Andrew, and we were talking about how to measure the effectiveness of trainings. And we had this whole conversation about sales software should be able to identify what reps need what trainings based on the metrics. And oh, by the way, if you want, automatically deploy training modules to those reps directly, or deploy training modules to a trainer, set up a meeting with those reps, have the trainer train the reps on those things, and then measure over time whether their metrics move based on that training. Well, to do all of that in the tool we had at the time was freaking impossible. We're building all that in Ops IQ.
Let's pause here for a second. Mark, let's go to your question.
Just got to unmute myself.
You got it.
The question is, Matt, how would you counsel a founder who's in an enterprise market but wants to have a transactional process?
Yeah, first I would say, you know, face the reality that the transactional sales process is completely different than an enterprise sales process.
Yep.
So I'm actually an investor in a software company that is making this transition right now, and I'm advising the founder on this exact thing. And first and foremost, just embrace that reality. And like my next 3 bullet points would be just embrace that reality, because the founder thinks that they're embracing that reality. And then they're like, but we can, you know, but we can just use the same sales leader, right? It's like, no, not necessarily. But this sales rep can just like go ahead, and they've been doing inbound enterprise, but they can go do outbound transactional, right? Like tomorrow, like, no, not necessarily. Same sales software, right? No, not necessarily. So just like completely embrace like 2 levels deeper than you think you are embracing the fact that it's a different process. And then I would just say, apply the design thinking to it. So acknowledge it's a totally different world, and be open to a bunch of different processes, and just apply the design thinking to it bottoms up. Now there's a bunch of like off the shelf lessons you can learn from, like, hey, think about scripting this way, think about compensation this way, you know, yada, yada. Like you don't have to totally reinvent the wheel, but apply design thinking to your product, maybe accelerated by some of those, you know, initial steps that have been built by other people.
Okay.
The most important, like 80% of it is just, it's a different process.
Well, yeah, well, I know that I'm in that situation now with a, I'd like to call it a startup with cash flow, where they want transactional, but we are enterprise. Our sales cycle is between 8 and 12 months. And it's all outbound. So
yeah,
it's a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, if that's a fact, right? It is. Then it's okay. How do you build processes around that? And that's not transactional.
No, it is not. It is not. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy. That's all.
You might want to share this specific clip, Mark, with this particular individual. Maybe that would be helpful.
Yeah, it's one of these things, and you know, you and I have been talking for a long time, Scott. I've been doing this for a very, very long time, and this is one of the ones where it's like, if I had my hair when I went into this, I'd have a hairline like it looks right now, and I'm kind of a little bit at your stage where it's like, the challenge is that 20 years ago I would have walked out with these guys, because it's been a little over a year. They don't want to learn. But now the challenge is what's got me going. I said, I'm going to turn these guys. And of course, all the metrics are following, you know, the revenue metrics and everything else is working. So it gives me a little bit of if you want to call it that safety net, to be a little bit more vocal back and forth.
Yeah, you're a little more emboldened now, right? You're more emboldened now because things are going your way a little bit. Maybe here's a way to spin this question, Matt. Like, let's say somebody's a sales leader, Mark's a sales leader, Lori's a sales leader, I'm the sales leader. How do I manage up to help get you out of your own way in Mark's scenario? This particular founder like needs to get out of their own way and kind of shut up and let the sales leader like do their thing. They're right. How does one go about doing that? Is that like data? Is it just an impassioned speech? Like, how would somebody go about doing that? Or how do you see that dynamic unfolding?
Yeah.
Can I
and don't reference the like 12 round fights, TKO fights that we would have.
Well, can I just say, I've basically come out and said, you got to get out of the way. It's not your strong suit.
Yeah.
We're already starting to work. You got to just get out of the way. Because it does have an effect on the morale of the sales team, because they see this, you know, they understand what's going on in the background, because they'll jump in and say, well, how come this and how, and it's like, get out of the way, just leave it alone. It's working. we keep iterating, we keep doing a lot of the things that you talked about, but it's like, just, it's working, just get out of the way. So, but I'd like to hear what you'd say.
Well, I mean, first it depends on the founder and you know, and what resonates with them, whether it's data or something, you know, a data and a passion story, like that matters. The audience, it matters for sure. But you know, I think the get out of the way thing is, I mean, it's a valid point, and is probably the answer more often than it isn't. But you know, I mean, I personally I struggle with that one. Like I have made mistakes where I have, like with the sales, not Scott, with the sales leader, you know, gotten out of the way because I'm like, I'm hiring this person because they have the playbook. They know more than I do. I'm going to get out of the way, but it just wasn't really resonating. I mean, my gut was telling me that it was wrong, but hey, they're the sales leader. I should get out of the way. Most of the time, honestly, that I got out of the way, that was a mistake. And so, you know, on the one hand, it's absolutely the right answer. On the other hand, like many founders, myself included, have been burned by just getting out of the way. And so I think, you know, and that doesn't mean the answer is like micromanage or what, like, you know, there's a whole separate conversation there, but, I think, you know, if it were me, if I were the founder, data, and Scott can speak to, like, data wins the day for me. And so it's okay if it is working. So here's the conversation. It is working, get out of the way. Like, as opposed to the get out of the way part, it's like, hey, here's where we were before. Here's where we are now with the data. Here's the trajectory we're on because of these premises. You know, are we aligned on our expectations that we want to be here? And are we aligned on the data that we're looking at? Are we looking at this data differently? Are we misaligned on the expectation? Just sort of alignment on the data and the expectations and the vision, and just bring it back to that level.
Yep. Cool.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Lori Dunn.
Hi. Opposite to Mark's question here. So when you don't have what works yet, but you're kind of close to finding it, how do you talk to the founders and the board, you know, about all the things you're trying to find the right fit? And on that, do you go and get advice and guidance there? Or is that my responsibility to find the options on my own and present that?
So, and related to this, back to Scott's question, I would overinvest in time spent sort of managing and not managing up, educating your leaders on this. And so I think you can use data to do that. But you know, it comes down to, like, specifically what you're talking about. You know, one way to approach that is, hey, you know, framing it as an experimentation. We haven't figured out what's working. We're going to be experimenting in this period of time. These are the experiments I'm running. This is what success looks like for the experiments. And, you know, let's judge me and the company on the quality of that decision-making, and certainly the outputs, but let's focus on both the quality of the decision-making and the outputs, because of the quality of the decision-making, including the quality of the process that you're using to make decisions, sort of the build, measure, learn loop is high, and you're, you know, all else held equal, like you're working hard and those sorts of things, like that's what's going to get you to the right answer as quickly as possible. And so, you know, I think it's education, data, and then reframing on, hey, this is an experimenting part of, there's an experimentation period, and let's not just look at the outcome, but the quality of decision-making. That's the latter part is really key. And there's a book by Annie Duke called Thinking in Bets that describes that really well. Which is, you know, she's a former poker player and also a professor. And, you know, she says that if you say there's a 90% probability of something happening, psychologically, you're thinking it's going to happen, but that 10% chance that it doesn't is real. And so that's an extreme example of, you know, a scenario of what we're talking about, 90-10, but like reframing as, hey, this is an experimenting period. This is not a sure bet. This is an experimentation period. And let's be judging on the quality of the decision-making along the way.
Thank you.
Is that enough, Lori?
You could always ask more.
It looks like you have more.
Oh, I would also say, I would definitely ask for advice. I mean, it depends, the context, you know, matters here, but in general, engage the board, engage the founder, be really transparent about this experimenting period, and ask for advice, welcome feedback, welcome ideas, etc.
Yeah, I'm actually really lucky. Like founders and board they're on the Lori train. We're good in that regard. I have them here. We're getting to a point now of I'm now becoming a founder in terms of like being able to pull out a founder-led sales. We're getting to a point where nerves are hitting in of like, okay, we still haven't figured this out. What's happening? What's going on here? And I think the question that I would love to ask is the runway of that. There's so many options. There's so many things out there, and it feels I'm in the new disruptive.
Are you talking about the runway for trying something and going down one particular path? Or are you talking about the runway for your life expectancy in this particular role without results?
I'm not worried about that, actually. I know a lot of people say I should
So-
be. I'm not actually worried about that. I'm worried more of, will the company be able to survive more learning when we're in this new thing that a lot of it is a lot of education, and I'm not getting a lot of deals coming in, which is a former just sales rep. It makes me nervous to not have more closing. And then it's the juxtaposition of managing my sales rep emotions of like, no, it's cool. You got this. I'm experimenting versus I'm trying a lot of different things. I'm working my butt off. They see it, they know it, they're on board with me. And then finding that one thing that then I can just really crush and then bring my 2 reps in and then start building it.
Yeah. Have you read the Lean Startup by Eric Ries, the book we talked about earlier?
Yes.
You have. Yeah. I think that's, I reread it recently. I think that's super helpful actually on this topic as it relates to sort of runway and experimenting and those sorts of things. Also touched on in that book is this concept of not vanity metrics, but like actual, I forget what it's called, but like actual like leading indicator type metrics. And I think focusing on what are the sort of the leading indicators as opposed to lagging indicators is really important as guideposts to how to make those decisions in that experimenting phase. And then, just really focusing on, you said the one thing, it's like, what is my hypothesis of the number one reason that I'm not making sales? And how can I attack that number one reason and just do that over and over and over and over again, which is part of the experimenting. But I think that's really important too. But honestly, the common thread I think is, acknowledging and communicating that you're in an experimenting phase, aligning with the founders and those around you, what success looks like, and then just like, having a good process for iterating through that. There's no silver bullet. It's just, build, measure, learn, loop as fast as possible through that period of time.
Thank you.
Matt, you probably didn't see, and that's fine, but there's like 7 or 8 people who replied that they're actually in, by your definition, a transactional sales cycle right now, in one founder at least and 4 or 5 sales leaders. So my question is, can you talk a little bit about like what KPIs should somebody be tracking in your mind who are in that particular market? What are the most important KPIs for transactional sales leaders and founders to be paying attention to for the sales org?
This is something I've spent a ton of time thinking about, especially in the last year as we built Ops IQ, which has sort of reporting out of the box. And I answer this question very, very often. One of the first things I would say to do, for someone that's trying to figure out, for example, how to scale a sales process or whatever, is first get a baseline of those KPIs so that that is the baseline of performance. Then you can figure out how to make sure you have a scalable process from there. What I would say, and I'm actually really curious for your answer on this, Scott, what I would say is if it's transactional sales process, dials, decision makers reached, demos set, demos held, and close rate. Those 5. There's like plenty more. You can get super fancy. But
can you repeat those 5 one more time in case I see a couple people trying to jot them down?
Yep. Sorry. Dials, decision makers reached. So these are all activity funnels. Dials, decision makers reached, demos set, demos held, and close rate. It's dials, and then it's conversion through that funnel. How many of those dials effectively result in a decision maker reached? How many of those decision makers reached result in a set demo? How many of those set demos result in a held demo? How many of those held demos close? And we could talk for hours about the nuances of all of those things and how to measure them and et cetera, but start with those 5, in my opinion.
I don't know if this was something that I said at Main Street Hub or not, or after that, but I call that the metrics to close. Those 5 KPIs right there. I don't remember when I started saying that, but yeah, there's obviously lots of other things that you can add, but one of the things that I really like doing is breaking it down to the smallest number of KPIs to measure and track as possible that are going to net results. And those 5, if you're in that kind of world, are, super important. If you're in a world in particular where the phone is a channel that is really working, then contrary to everybody's opinion, like the dial count still matters, right? So anyway.
And Laura, you can use that as an example. I'm sure you're doing this, but to answer your question, like which one of those 5 metrics do you want to affect? Where is it break? Like, are your reps dialing 80 dials a day, 60 dials a day? Great. Okay. Are you converting to decision makers at a rate that seems reasonable? Great. Okay. But you aren't setting demos.
Okay. Why? So let's break down, let's break down these 5 KPIs for everybody and like the problem they're in if the conversion percentages like tank. So if you're not making enough calls, that one's obvious. So you're not connecting with enough decision makers. Like, what does that tell you about what is busted or what needs to be worked on? So I'm making enough calls, but I'm not connecting with enough decision makers. What does that tell you?
You're not creating enough value with the gatekeeper to get to the decision maker, assuming it's not a sale to like a real estate agent, for example, where the decision maker is just picking up their phone. But if the problem is you're not reaching enough decision makers, you're not building enough value with gatekeepers quickly enough to get to the decision maker would be my answer.
Yeah.
There's a couple nuance pieces, like you could be calling into healthcare and you have to navigate through a decision.
Yeah.
I mean, like a phone tree, but those.
Yeah. If let's assume that we're calling the right ICP and everything's right. So like said differently, like the start of your phone call sucks.
Yeah.
That's simple. Okay. So now let's say that part's fine. We're getting a decision maker, but we're not setting enough demos. So I'm talking to decision makers, but I'm not setting enough demos. What's busted there?
You're not creating enough value, period, or quickly enough, i.e. with enough urgency to get them to see the full product on a demo.
What do you think? This was one thing that I think you haven't said one word yet. And that would be, they don't believe that they have this particular problem.
Oh, pain?
Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. Okay. So now they set a demo, but they don't show up. What's busted?
Well, you didn't build enough value in the first place to get them on the demo.
There's a recurring theme here of value, value, value. If you haven't noticed, so they don't show up to your demos. None of you have that problem, of course. Everybody has 100% show rate for all their demos, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. So now if they don't close, so you held a demo, but they not close. What's busted? So I'm your sales rep, Matt. I hit the right number of calls. I connected with good amount of DMs. I set a bunch of demos. I held a bunch of demos. In fact, I've held 25 demos and I haven't closed a single deal. What the hell is going on?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's value, but here it's urgency and price could be a factor. I mean, certainly throughout the funnel, but just following the freaking sales process could be a factor here. But I mean, honestly, to me, and it sounds overly simplistic, it's value, but that can be defined in slightly different ways throughout the sales funnel. But it's like building enough value with the gatekeeper to get the decision maker on the phone, building enough value as quickly as possible with the decision maker to get them to agree to a demo, and then having them remember the value that you just built with them to show up to the demo. And if they find enough value in the product by definition, they will sign up. And so a lot of nuances to all of that, but at the end of the day, all roads point back to value, including at the close, like price relates to value.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, we've got a question from you. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just curious, in a transactional process, do you think that there's a gain in using maybe a full cycle AE to do their own calling, or do you think that it's still better to use an SDR, do a handoff to an AE to, somewhere through the sales process to close?
That depends, in my opinion, on context about the sales process, the industry, the product, et cetera. My favorite though is always start with a full cycle sales rep and then optimize with an SDR AE split if it makes sense to do so. But I'm a big fan of full cycle for a bunch of reasons, including, well, a bunch of reasons that I'm happy to go into if helpful. One of the things though that we built in our sales software, a pain that we were trying to solve, is the SDR to AE handoff is really painful for a bunch of reasons. So making that as seamless as possible is key. It's actually pretty freaking hard to do that with sales software that exists. And that handoff for a transactional sales process where you're doing a live transfer or booking, maybe you want to book 2 demos on an AE's calendar at the same time because you have a 50% hold rate and you really want to optimize for making sure that AE's time is booked. All that stuff gets a little bit more complicated in a transactional sales environment, which is another reason that I would start with a full cycle sales rep and then optimize with an SDR AE split. And that optimization can result in more sales or more attractive customer acquisition costs, or sometimes both. But I would almost always start with a full cycle rep.
You said can you talk a little bit more about, you said something to the effect of like, and then maybe optimize with an SDR kind of later on. So it's like, what would be the things that you might see where you'd say, okay, an SDR might make sense now in this transactional environment? Is it a particular price point that you start to reach? Like what is the signal to you?
Yeah, price point is one signal. Length of sales cycle, which is sometimes related to price point, can be another signal. But really, to cut to the chase, it's it's this confluence of the difficulty of getting to the decision maker on the phone and the speed of the sales cycle. And so, for example, at Main Street Hub, we had a really fast sales cycle, and it was pretty difficult to get the decision maker back on the phone sometimes. So if you had a decision maker on the phone, and because the sales cycle was possible that you could close sales in one call, you kind of want your person opening up the call to try to close the call right then. Now, we certainly would want to test SDR AE handoff in that environment too. If you're really looking to optimize, why not test it? But that's an example of, hey, really it's hard to get the decision maker back on the phone. This product can be sold on one call. Make it a full cycle rep.
Great. Any last closing kind of words, remarks? We maybe got time for 1 or 2 more questions if anybody has any, but I don't have any in the queue right now. Matt, what do you want to impart upon us before we get out of here?
Those of you who are in transactional sales processes, which again, I define as 1 day to 90 days, and the definition I said earlier, keep fighting the good fight. A lot of respect for you. Often in the industry, enterprise sales gets more love than transactional sales, and I'm with you on the transactional sales side. So shout out to all the transactional sales folks in the house, and keep fighting the good fight.
We snuck one in. JD, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am.
Sneak your question in here, man.
Yeah, just curious. By the way, thanks for having me. All new to the group, and just curious about SDR to AE handoff. How have you optimized? How do you think about it? You had mentioned that tools are difficult to do that, so I'm just kind of curious to get your perspective on it before we end.
Yeah. When what I mean by optimize is, I certainly think there's ways to optimize the SDR AE handoff, and I'll answer that directly. But what I mean optimize is start with a full cycle rep, which is easier and cleaner to get baseline data and just easier out of the gates for a variety of reasons. And then if now you're looking in, and you get success, and now you're looking to optimize your sales process, one of the ways you can optimize your sales process is to test bifurcating the SDRs from the AEs and see if you get, faster sales cycle, more attractive customer acquisition costs, et cetera, from that split. Now, if we're talking about optimizing the SDR to AE handoff, some things that, that I would look out for are being able to do live transfers. So being able to do live transfers, 100% of the time, 100% of the time, being able to smartly book demos for AEs. For example, not just what AE is available right now, but what is the best AE for this prospect that's available right now? And then how do you define best AE is a whole separate conversation. One idea is a concept of double booking AEs. So if you have, if you know your hold rate is 50%, you might want to book 2 demos at the same for every time slot for an AE. And, half the time or some of the time, 2 prospects will show up. Well, you can create a flow to have someone else handle that other prospect, but you don't have slack in your system. And there's trade-offs of that, we can go into the nuances of. But one way to think about this in summary is actually 2 concepts here. One is best lead to best rep, as opposed to just, hey, fairness and round robin, et cetera. Best lead to best rep and SDR handoffs. And 2 is think about this concept of you have a demo, like a prospect that wants a demo, and you have time slots. And AEs make up those time slots, and the leads make up those demos. And it's just how do you smartly connect those demos with those time slots? And shameless plug for Ops IQ, we automatically do that. But that's what I would be focused on for in your tools and in your processes. You can do that all manually, but think time slots and of reps and demos.
Thank you.
All right, good question, JD. All right, everybody, I think we're gonna wrap it up. Thanks for coming to Tequila Tuesday. Special thanks to Matt Stewart. Check out Ops IQ, connect with Matt on LinkedIn. I dropped his LinkedIn profile on there as well as his email. And we'll see you all next time. Thanks again, everybody. And thanks to Sendoso for sponsoring this and making it happen. Have a good night.
See ya.